To understand why Castor Hetfield hid his music career from his father for over a decade, you need to know what it was like growing up as James Hetfield's son. Castor Virgil Hetfield was born in 1998, the second of James Hetfield's 3 children. He grew up in Vail, Colorado, where his father had moved the family to escape rock star chaos and provide a more normal childhood. But being James Hetfield's son was never normal. Castor's father was one of the biggest rock stars in the world, the frontman of Metallica. Even in quiet Vail, the Hetfield name carried weight. James tried to be a good father, attending school events, coaching sports, spending time with Castor. But James also had specific ideas about doing things right. Music was particularly important. James had built his life around heavy metal. It wasn't just his job, it was his identity, his worldview, his religion. When Castor showed interest in music as a teenager, James was thrilled. He bought Castor a high-end electric guitar, set up lessons, and encouraged him to learn Metallica songs. But Castor's musical interests were developing differently. While his father listened to Metallica and Slayer, Castor discovered Bob Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel, Sufjan Stevens, and Bon Iver. He loved acoustic guitars, gentle melodies, vulnerable lyrics, intimacy and emotion rather than power and aggression. At first, he tried to hide this preference. He practiced the metal songs his father assigned, went through the motions of learning the techniques James valued. But in private, Castor would pull out an acoustic guitar and write his own songs, folk-influenced, melodic, nothing like Metallica. When Castor was 16, he worked up the courage to show his father one of his songs. He played it on acoustic guitar in the family's music room, a gentle, melancholic piece about feeling different from everyone around you, about not fitting into the mold people expected. James listened quietly. When Castor finished, there was a long silence. Then James said, "That's nice, but it's not real music. If you're going to do music seriously, you need to play metal. This soft stuff, anyone can do that. Metal takes skill, takes power. If you're serious about music, do it right, metal or nothing." Castor was devastated. He'd poured his heart into that song, and his father had dismissed it as not real music. The message was clear. Either become a metal musician like James or don't bother with music at all. For a while, Castor stopped writing songs. He went through the motions of his metal lessons, but felt increasingly disconnected from the music. His relationship with his father became strained. They still spent time together, but there was a wall between them, the unspoken disappointment that Castor wasn't following in his father's footsteps the right way. But Castor couldn't stop loving the music he loved. By 18, as he prepared for college, he was writing again in secret. He'd record rough demos on his phone, never sharing them with anyone. The songs became an outlet for all the feelings he couldn't express to his father, the pressure to be someone he wasn't, the pain of rejection, the determination to find his own path. When Castor went to college at UC Berkeley in 2016, studying literature rather than music, he felt freedom. Away from his father's shadow, he could explore music on his own terms. He performed at open mic nights under the name Castor Virgil, using his middle name to maintain some connection to his identity while keeping his famous last name hidden. The Berkeley folk scene embraced him. People responded to his songs, but he knew if anyone discovered he was James Hetfield's son, everything would change. So he kept the secret, avoiding talk about his family. After college, Castor faced a decision: professional musician or real job. His father assumed the latter. Castor chose music, on his terms. He moved to Portland, working at a coffee shop while dedicating his energy to writing and recording. His sound crystallized, indie folk with influences from Iron and Wine and Fleet Foxes, vulnerable vocals, intricate guitar work, lyrics about family, identity, and finding yourself outside of other people's expectations. By 2022, Castor had recorded a full album.
He'd saved money from his coffee shop job and a small inheritance from his grandmother to fund the recording and production. The album was deeply personal, songs about growing up in the shadow of fame, about parental expectations and artistic identity, about learning to value your own path even when the people you love can't see its worth. He released it independently in early 2023 under the name Castor Virgil. The cover art was abstract, no photos of him, nothing that would reveal his identity. His social media presence was minimal and carefully curated to avoid any connection to his real family. At first, the album had modest success, a few thousand streams on Spotify, some positive reviews from indie music blogs. Castor was pleased. It was more response than he'd expected for a completely unknown artist. Then, something unexpected happened. A TikTok user discovered one of the album's songs, a track called Metallic Silence, about the irony of growing up in a house filled with loud music while feeling unheard. The user created a video pairing the song with footage of them and their parent, captioning it, "When your parent doesn't understand you, but you still love them." The video went viral. Within days, millions of people had heard Metallic Silence. The song's themes, parental expectations, feeling invisible despite being surrounded by noise, learning to find your own voice, resonated with countless people dealing with their own family dynamics. Many sought out the full album, discovering that every track offered the same emotional honesty. More TikTok videos followed, each one using different songs from the album to express complex feelings about family, identity, and expectations. The algorithm pushed the music to wider and wider audiences. Music that had started with a few thousand streams was now reaching millions. By summer 2023, Castor Virgil's album had climbed to #1 on the indie charts. Metallic Silence was streaming millions of times per week. Music critics were writing about this mysterious new artist who seemed to have appeared from nowhere with a fully formed artistic vision. Interview requests poured in. Music publications wanted to know who Castor Virgil was, where he'd come from, what his story was. Record labels offered deals, but Castor declined all interviews and kept his identity hidden. He wanted the music to speak for itself, without the baggage of his family name. Through all of this, James Hetfield had no idea. Castor hadn't told his father about the album. They spoke occasionally, awkward phone calls where James asked about Castor's job and Castor gave vague answers about working in Portland. James assumed his son had given up on music, just as he'd expected. Then, in September 2023, investigative music journalist Emma Rodriguez began digging into the mystery of Castor Virgil. She was fascinated by an artist who could achieve such success while maintaining complete anonymity in the age of social media. Through property records, copyright registrations, and connections in the Portland music scene, Emma pieced together the truth. Castor Virgil was Castor Hetfield. The viral indie folk star was James Hetfield's son. Emma wrote an extensive article for Rolling Stone, revealing the connection and contextualizing Castor's music within the framework of growing up as a rock legend's child. She'd managed to get quotes from some of Castor's Portland friends about his talent and dedication. She analyzed the lyrics of Metallic Silence and other songs with the knowledge of who Castor's father was, finding layers of meaning that had been hidden before. The article exploded. Within hours, it was the most read piece on Rolling Stone's website. Social media erupted with reactions. Metallica fans were shocked. James Hetfield's son was making folk music, and he'd been doing it in secret for years?
The revelation changed everything for Castor. Suddenly, his anonymity was gone. People wanted to know more about him, about his relationship with his father, about what James Hetfield thought of his son's music. For James, learning about his son's success through a Rolling Stone article was jarring. He read Emma's piece with growing astonishment. His son had released an album, had gone to #1 on the charts, had built an entire career without telling him? And the music? James listened to the album for the first time. These were the kind of songs he'd dismissed years earlier as not real music. But hearing them now, with the knowledge that millions of people had connected with them, that critics praised them, that his son had achieved genuine success, James had to reckon with the fact that he'd been wrong. One song in particular struck James, "Metallic Silence." Listening to the lyrics about a son desperate for his father's approval, about feeling invisible despite being surrounded by noise, about learning to find your own voice when no one else will listen, James understood for the first time the depth of pain his dismissal had caused. A few days after the article published, James called Castor. The conversation was difficult. There was hurt on both sides, Castor angry that he'd had to hide his career for years, James defensive about his parenting, both of them struggling to articulate feelings that had been buried for too long. But they kept talking. Over the following weeks, through difficult phone calls and eventually a visit to Portland, James and Castor began to rebuild their relationship. James admitted he'd been wrong. "I thought there was only one way to do music seriously," he told Castor. "I was trying to protect you from what I thought was a waste of time, but you proved me wrong. You made something real, something that matters to people. I'm sorry I couldn't see that before." Castor appreciated the apology, but was also honest about his own feelings. "I didn't need your approval to succeed," he said. "I proved that. I built this career without your help, without your name. But I'm not going to lie, having your respect now, after all these years, it means something. It doesn't erase the past, but it means something." They talked about music in a new way, not as father lecturing son about the right way to do things, but as two musicians with different approaches and styles, learning to appreciate each other's craft. James listened to Castor's album in its entirety, really listened this time, and found beauty in music that was nothing like what he'd spent his life creating. In November 2023, Castor performed his first concert under his real name, Castor Hetfield, not Castor Virgil. The show was at a small venue in Portland, intimate and acoustic, nothing like a Metallica arena show. James flew to Portland to attend. He sat in the back of the venue watching his son perform to a sold-out crowd of fans who'd discovered him through TikTok and fallen in love with his honest, vulnerable songs. When Castor introduced "Metallic Silence," he said, "This song is about my relationship with my father. For a long time, that relationship was defined by silence, things we couldn't say to each other, ways we couldn't understand each other. But tonight, my dad is here, and I want him to know, I don't need you to love my music. I just need you to respect that it's mine." The crowd erupted in applause. James, sitting in the back, felt tears in his eyes. His son was right. The music didn't have to be what James would have chosen. It just had to be real, and it was. After the show, father and son embraced backstage. "I'm proud of you," James said, "not because you hit #1, though that's incredible, but because you did it your way. You didn't compromise. You didn't use my name. You built something that's completely yours. That takes more courage than I gave you credit for." The story of Castor Hetfield and his secret music career resonated far beyond Metallica fans or indie folk listeners. It touched a universal nerve, the struggle between parental expectations and personal authenticity, the courage required to pursue your own path when the people you love don't understand it, and the possibility of reconciliation when both sides are willing to see each other clearly. Castor's success continued. His album remained on the charts for months. He began touring, building a dedicated fan base who appreciated both his music and his story. Some Metallica fans became Castor Hetfield fans, discovering music they'd normally dismiss as too soft could be powerful in its own way. James, for his part, became a supporter. He mentioned Castor's music in interviews, always careful to emphasize that his son had achieved success independently. He attended more shows when touring schedules allowed, and privately he worked on understanding that there were many ways to make meaningful music, not just the one he'd devoted his life to. The relationship between James and Castor would never be simple. There were too many years of hurt, too much pride on both sides, too many fundamental differences in how they saw the world. But they found a way forward, not by one of them winning the argument about what real music meant, but by accepting that they could both be right in their own ways. For Castor, the revelation of his identity was ultimately freeing. He no longer had to hide who he was or worry about living in his father's shadow. He'd proven he could succeed on his own terms. The Hetfield name was now associated with two very different types of music, and that was okay. The story asks difficult questions about parenting, art, and identity. How much should we encourage our children to follow in our footsteps versus finding their own path? When does guidance become pressure? How do we measure success, by our own standards or by the impact we have on others? James Hetfield had spent decades knowing exactly what doing it right meant in music. His son showed him that there were other ways to do it right, ways he'd never considered, paths he'd dismissed without really looking at them. And Castor learned something too, that seeking approval from those who matter to us is human, even when we claim not to need it. That building something independently is powerful, but sharing it with the people we love can make it more meaningful. Metal or nothing is what James had said all those years ago. Castor had chosen nothing, or at least nothing that looked like metal. And in doing so, he'd created something beautiful, something entirely his own, something that millions of people connected with. That's the real victory. Not the #1 album or the viral TikToks or the critical acclaim, but the courage to be yourself, even when the people you love most can't see the value in it. And eventually, if you're lucky, they might learn to see it anyway.